Hello, welcome back to the Murakami Companion podcast, a show inspired by the works of Haruki Murakami where we analyze his body of work in its entirety. Today we'll be talking about the conclusion of the Rat Trilogy, often regarded as the first real novel of Murakami, and one I have found people are pretty fond of: A Wild Sheep Chase. Beware, this is not a review, it's more like a chat about the book, so there's gonna be some spoilers. Also, if you want additional context for this episode, you can listen to our previous episodes about Hear the Wind Sing and Pinball 1973, which are the first two books in the series. If you have listened to our podcast so far, you are already familiar with the Narrator and the Rat. By this point, they haven't seen each other for quite a while, since the first book actually, and they communicate through letters. The Rat seems to be metaphorically lost in a different world, because he took a different path in life as the narrator, as we have established in the previous books. And now Murakami decided that that path leads to magic. And yes, this is the first Murakami book to feature actual magic. Before going into the synopsis of the book, we gotta talk about magic. Across his body of work, Murakami has books with magic and books without magic. In some of them, especially in the later books, he states the rules of how that magic works. And surprisingly, it tracks down very well. It's pretty consistent with the early books. All of the books, actually. Those rules are: first, you have to do something extraordinary to cross to the realm where magical things happen. That is established in 1Q84. Again, pretty consistent. Books where no magic happens have no one doing anything extraordinary, and vice versa. Secondly, magical events that happens during daytime are not the same kind of magic that events that happen during the night. That is established in After Dark. They're just different. Nighttime magic is creepy and dangerous. You don't want to get involved in those. Daytime magic may be dangerous too, but not in a violent or creepy way. Number 3. Magic in the world of Murakami are metaphors and symbols and concepts and ideas, as it is established in Killing Commendatory. Once again, this tracks. Whenever a magical entity appears, it's standing for something more abstract. Whenever a character goes through an event where there's magic involved, that magic is a metaphor for internal processes, or a societal process, or something like that. Number 4 has to do with the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle and the fact that there are things that might interrupt the flow of events. For example, you can get stuck in life. Your life may not move forward if there is something obstructing that path. And that metaphor is kind of central through the entire bibliography of Murakami. And number 5 comes from the city and its uncertain walls, where it's stated that we all have like a dark version of ourselves, like a shadow, and that shadow lives in the more metaphorical abstract world, and that shadow is actually our unconscious. Like our normal selves or our earthly selves, our consciousness is connected to our consciousness, and the internal world is connected to us through our shadow self. That's the version of us that lives there. Also, sometimes characters get lost in a place they can't come back from. They just disappear. It is implied that there is magic involved in this, that they are taken away. My interpretation has to do with rules number 1 and 2. They do something extraordinary, they cross the line between this world and the magic world, and they are taken away from the physical world by that dark side of the magical world. Again, when we add rule number 3, it also means that that disappearance is also somewhat metaphorical. This is explained in a more clear way in The City and its Uncertain Walls, but I don't want to spoil that. Back to the wild sheep chase. The story is about the narrator that is working on his company, business that he owns, and the rat sends him a photograph of a sheep with a spot in the shape of a star. He uses the photo for a client, for advertisement, and the mafia sees it and they need that sheep because it gives enlightenment and strength to the people that come in contact with it. And the mafia boss is sick and needs to reconnect with this sheep to survive, so the narrator and his girlfriend travel the country in search for his friend the rat, who may lead them to the magical sheep. That's the basis for the book. This book not only introduces magic, but also talks about the culture of Japan after World War II, and softly about the influence of the United States in that, which is a recurrent topic in Murakami's work. He has a love for the American music and literature, and yet an acknowledgement that America's military and government are the bad guys in Japan's history in the 20th century, which I love that he's able to make that distinction. Personally, I have seen music artists perform in countries their countries are literally at war with, and there's an universal understanding that artists and geopolitical conflicts are two separate things. However, the magical sheep does not seem to make that distinction. As we said before, magic in the world of Murakami are metaphors and symbols and concepts and ideas. And the magic here is that the sheep, which is kind of an animal that is not native from Japan, it's brought from the outside, and it gives the person it crosses path with enlightenment and the ability to succeed, but also in a way you are becoming a puppet of the sheep, you are possessed by the sheep. The story continues the trend of the last two books, the characters growing older and growing apart. In fact, the rat is now just a long-lost friend that no one knows much about, except for very rare letters he sends once in a while. The narrator is a divorced man working as an advertisement executive, and the rat, honestly, he hasn't changed at all, and he gets more and more lost in time. So they look for the rat in hopes he can help them find the sheep, which at this point they don't know that it doesn't have a corporeal form. So they go to a house far away from the city, close from where the photograph was taken, and they wait for the owner of the house to arrive, which the narrator guesses, through several clues that are explained in the book, that the owner is the rat himself. Here's where things get a little tricky. There's this guy, who is the shipman, who is lurking around the house. It's a dude in a sheep costume. One day, the girlfriend is gone. At night, in the middle of the darkness, the rat arrives and chats with the narrator. Plot twist, the rat is dead. He says he hanged himself in the garage a week before they arrived and asked the shipman to bury him. This is because the rat had the sheep inside of him, like the sheep is not physical, but it exists. It has a sort of incorporeal form, and it can go inside of people to possess them, as we have already established. So he sort of tries to possess the rat, but he doesn't lose control of his body because the rat refused the enlightenment that the sheep had to offer and decided to kill the sheep while it was inside of him. Because, you know, as we established in the previous books, the rat has like his own philosophy of life, and he kind of rejects anything and everyone that doesn't align to that personal philosophy. Also, the sheepman is the rat. And it's also kind of implied that the girlfriend, who at this point has left the house and the narrator and left the story completely, was possessed by the sheep when she left. Also, the rat left a bomb in the house and the narrator activates it, leaves. The assistant to the mafia boss arrives to tell him that the boss is dead and he wants to be possessed by the sheep. The assistant goes into the house and the house explodes and the mafia thing is pretty much over. So the questions are, what happened to the sheep? You can say that it died with the rat, or that it lived on either with the sheepman, who might have been the rat himself, or the girlfriend. It's really up to you. The second question is, what happened to the rat? You can either say he lied about killing himself, or that the whole conversation was a dream or an hallucination, or that it was metaphorical and the rat identity died and the human previously known as the rat lives on as the sheepman. You can also say that the sheepman was a different person and that the narrator is wrong. Also, by the way, maybe the rat at this point, as well as the sheepman and the sheep itself, all of these animal-related characters, maybe none of them were 100% physical entities at this point. This is Murakami, and of course, many things are up for interpretation. I tell you what I think happens, and you can tell me if you think I'm right or wrong. I think that the rat misunderstood how the sheep works. He killed himself to try to kill the sheep within him, but the sheep just went away and then possessed the girlfriend of the narrator. The ghosts of the rat keep on living as the sheepman. Why this form? Well, the sheep possesses people, uses them as disguise, and climbs the social and political ladder. The sheepman is a human dressed as a sheep, who seems to be a person free from the rest of society, living in the woods, which is kind of what the rat wants to be. The rat rejected the sheep and became exactly the opposite concept. But honestly, there's no strict right answer. I remember Quentin Tarantino, a film director that Murakami even mentions as an influence in one of his books, saying that when you leave something unanswered, the great thing about it is that every viewer sees a different movie, and every reader reads a different book as well. And Murakami is really good at this. He doesn't seem to even be doing it on purpose. It's more like he doesn't feel the need to explain everything. And that's a good way of being respectful with the reader. Whatever it is that you understood from a work of art is perfectly valid. What I take from the Trilogy of the Rat is the story of two friends who grew apart. One is the narrator, who went to the university, had adventures, opened a business, got married, got divorced, got a girlfriend, had friends, etc. The other one stayed always at the same bar, got his money from rich parents, didn't study, didn't have a job, and then started to fade away, grew distant from everyone he knew, traveled to distant places, sent letters, got possessed by a spirit, and finally killed himself because he rejected what that spirit offered, which was to be a big player in the society he rejected. The narrator has always been the normal guy in this situation, and we will continue his adventures a little bit longer with Dance Dance Dance, the next entry in the series. But this is the end for the rat. Not a normal guy, not a bad guy either, just a guy who had some flaws. A guy who was different, who couldn't find his place among other people. The two human beings he connected with were Jay, the bar owner, and the narrator. One was barely a friend, and the other one he hasn't seen for years. And then he found the sheep and the mafia that was built with the influence of the sheep, and he found his opposite, and he gave his life in that fight. He was deeply lost in the world, but in the end he managed to stay true to himself and make a difference. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's what the trilogy of the rat is about. You might be offered everything in life in exchange to stop being yourself and become controlled by something else, or you can refuse to give that up, stay true to yourself, and find the right path. You can get a wild sheep chase pretty much anywhere where good books are sold. If you want to support this podcast, or you just like cool t-shirts, or maybe some coffee mugs or art prints, we got a few digital stores where you can find all of that and more, featuring the covered artwork for this episode, inspired by a wild sheep chase. There will be one design for each episode release of this podcast.